QuickBooks Online 2025 Navigation Overview and Company Settings. Get ready and some coffee because we're learning how to save time with QuickBooks Online 2025. Here we are in our QuickBooks Online Get Great Guitars 2025 project file we set up in a prior presentation. This time looking at the general navigation within the system, then spending a lot more time on the settings of QuickBooks Online, typically found in the cog up top. Noting that many people don't have a lot of experience really diving into the different settings within QuickBooks Online, even if they're bookkeepers or work in the accounting department with QuickBooks Online for multiple different reasons. One being that oftentimes when we take on a project, we're working with a company file that has already been set up, and therefore the foundation or underlying settings are already in place. So we don't spend a lot of time really looking at those once we're in a company file that is already set up and in place, but rather have to deal with these settings as, for example, in this practice problem, when we set up a new company file. Also, oftentimes people work within a certain industry. So if you work within a certain industry, you might have particular settings that you know are applicable to your particular industry, but might not spend a lot of time looking at all the variant settings that might be applicable to other industries. So we'll go into those in more detail. Quick recap on the basic navigation of the system that we talked about in a prior course or section, just to get an idea or review, remembering that we're in a web-based system typically. Now you might be able to download like a desktop version of the QuickBooks Online and still be able to use it on the desktop if you wanted to. We might look at that within the settings here in more detail. There are some advantages to that, because then you still might have to access online to get online, but you might be able to get away with a little bit of less access online. And they try to tailor that to look more like the desktop version, which you might be used to and has its pros and cons. And that might help some people as they move from a desktop version of QuickBooks Online to the online version. However, I think most people are still finding that navigating in an online web browse-based system is better. It's the way it's designed to go, and most likely the thing that's most likely, in my opinion, to be kept up and updated properly basically going forward. Now, remember that when you're on the desktop system, the system didn't change that much. The idea was we want to keep it the same. So for years, the desktop system layout was basically the same. They didn't do much to it. Whereas if you're in a website, if you deal with any kind of website, you'll note that the website often changes a lot because web designers like to change the website. So what they're trying to do is look for the optimal page in the optimal amount of clicks or user-friendly pages. Usually we're thinking about sales pages when we think about those kind of things, but you can clearly see that when you're an accounting system, they are applying the same concepts. They're basically A/B testing each of the web pages that we go on to see which is most effective, and then they change the web page. So there's going to be a lot more rapid changes, which in part is why we update our course basically at least on a yearly basis, so we can get the latest look and feel of all the changes that keep on happening with the QuickBooks Online software. The general layout is going to be basically the same, however, and that's going to be that we have the information on the left-hand side, which is going to be part of the place that we go to navigate the software. We've got the plus button or the new button, which has been named multiple different things, which typically has the normal data input forms that we're going to use. And then we have the information up top, the cog, and our button right here, which is going to give us the general settings, the kind of foundational type of items. Before we get into those in more detail, just remember also that you can zoom in by, if you're in a Windows-based system, which I am, I hold down Control and scroll up on the scroll wheel, and you can zoom in. You can also see the plus button in your scroll bar. I'm not a Mac expert, so if you have a Macintosh, then I'm sure you could figure out, you probably have your own idea of how you scroll into a web page, right? So we have that. And also remember that you can add new tabs So instead of having multiple windows open or toggling between windows on a web-based, on a desktop system, we can toggle between tabs. How do we do that? We right-click on the tab and duplicate the tab, and now I can toggle between the two tabs. Now, you do have to make sure that you refresh both of the tabs. So if I'm running a report on one tab, for example, and doing data input on another tab, I need to refresh the report, as we will see multiple times, to make sure that it is up to date, that it picked up the new information in the new tab. So that's going to be important. If I want to see things side by side, if I have two screens, for example, I can detach this tab, which is nice because now I can put the two tabs possibly side by side, which is cool. And then I can attach the tab back, and that's great too. So I can have the tabs basically lined up top in the order of relevance as I'm going through them. Now, also note that if you wanted to get into the sample company file at the same time that you're in QuickBooks Online, just to test something out in a sample company, the test drive, you can't usually do it in the same browser because you're already logged in under different credentials. So you can open it up in another browser, or if you're in Google Chrome, or you can use whatever parallel function in any browser you're using. I'm not advertising Google Chrome, that's what I have here, but you can open up incognito window and then look for QuickBooks Online Test Drive, right? QuickBooks Online Test Drive. And that way I can open up this test drive. I'm looking for the Intuit site. I'm going to choose the United States version of the software, and then we verify that we're not a robot, and then continue. And so now we have a system that already has stuff in it that we can test out. Remember that this resource is great for practice on things when there's already data in the system and I'm not doing a comprehensive long problem, because it's going to refresh every time you log out and back into it. Whereas what I want to do now in our practice problem over here is start a new company file that doesn't have any data in it. In other words, if I go to the reports on the left-hand side, for example, and I open up my balance sheet, there's going to be nothing there, right? So I have nothing to practice with because there's nothing on the balance sheet. So there it is. So we have just a blank, basically, report. All right. So that's going to be the general kind of navigation. Remember, as you're using QuickBooks Online, then what's going to be the process? I'll go back to the dashboard. The middle part of the system, the middle display area, is going to be the display area. It's kind of funny that the dashboard is usually not where you're going to spend most of your time navigating into things. You got the home tab, you've got your cash flow up top, you've got your planner, gives you some information, but normally when you're doing your day-to-day work, you're going to not spend a lot of time on the dashboard. You're instead going to go into the forms that you're going to do the data input on. So in order to do the day-to-day input, how is that going to work? First, we have to lay down the foundation, kind of like the infrastructure of a city, those foundational items being things like lists and settings. So that's going to be up here. So we're going to go over this in future presentations in a lot more detail and look at all of these items. But you want to get your settings set up properly, and then you want to at least get your lists set up. The major lists are going to be the general ledger accounts or the chart of accounts and the products and services. So that, at a minimum, we need to get set up, but we'll go through more of these options as well, which are usually the underlying foundation things that we want to get going and correct before we start actually entering data into the system. Once that's set up, once we have our chart of accounts, then we could add the beginning balances if we had a prior accounting system that we need to do that for, which we will do in our practice system. Once that's set up, then we can actually finally enter data in the current system, which we might do in part with the use of bank feeds, which would be part of the foundation systems that we would set up in part of the settings, right? Connecting to the bank. We have to determine what kind of system we're using as to how the bank feeds are going to fit, but we can do that. Now, we're going to do this practice problem without the bank feeds so that we could see how the system works without the bank feeds, talking about how the bank feeds would impact particular transactions, helping us to determine when and how bank feeds would be used. In a future course or section, we'll basically build a set of books using the bank feeds primarily. All right, so then as I do the day-to-day data input, then we can go to the forms up top, which are broken out by cycle. Customer cycle, money ultimately coming in for goods and services we provided to clients. Vendor cycle, money ultimately going out for goods and services we purchased in order to help us generate revenue, whether those be expenses or assets. We've got the payroll cycle if we're dealing with payroll within the system, and then the other cycle. These are all forms that create the journal entries according to the double entry accounting system, which we could think in terms of debits and credits, but oftentimes from a financial standpoint, we think in terms of the accounting equation, each form having at least two accounts impacted, those two accounts impacting the accounting equation in such a way that they will remain in balance or having an equal number of debits and credits if you want to think of it that way. So once we enter the data into the system, that will build the financial statements, which is our end goal that we're constructing. Now, certain times I'll have to actually talk to customers and vendors. When I say actually, sometimes you don't, right? Because sometimes you're in a type of industry, you don't spend a lot of time talking to the customers and whatnot after the transaction is done. If you're at a restaurant, you spend time talking to the customers at the restaurant. You don't spend a lot of time in the bookkeeping system talking to the customers because they already paid you. But if you're in a tax business or a law firm, you're going to spend more time talking to the customers to try to get them to pay you. Same with the vendor side of things. So as we talk to our customers and vendors, that happens in what I would call the centers or the tabs, primarily the sales tab over here, where you have your customers. We talked about this more detail in a prior course or section, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to do a quick recap. And then in the expenses, this is basically the vendor center. So this is where we can track the vendor information. And then the bank feeds are being tracked as their own thing as we record the bank feeds in the transactions, which we'll spend more time on here in the bank transactions if we were to set that up, which we'll spend a lot more time on in future courses or sections. All right, so that means that we have to set up this time the foundational items before we can do this before we can just start entering data. In other words, you can't just set up a new company file and then just willy-nilly connect to the bank feeds and then just start recording things. You could do that, but you're going to end up with a mess, right? Because you haven't entered your beginning balances, you don't have your general ledger set up, you might not know how to record the bank feeds, how they fit into the accounting system, and you're going to end up with a whole bunch of transactions in what I call bank feed limbo, and it's going to be ugly if you don't do it in order. This is one of those things there's two types of problems in the world typically. You've got like ones that you tinker with something until you get good at it, and ones that you're way better off figuring out how to do it first before you start tinkering with it, right? So like playing the guitar, for example, or something, if you're learning something, you can tinker with it to see what sounds good or something like that. But if you're trying to cut a piece of wood to put in a door frame, you don't want to just keep on cutting, you don't want to overcut the wood particularly, and then say you have to glue it back together. That doesn't work. Similarly here, there's some things we can tinker with the bookkeeping system, but some things you want to get the process right from the start, or it's going to cause you a lot more pain, right? So it's good to be able to recognize those two different kinds of situations and approach them, properly, because otherwise, in a tinkering situation, you get a person that is too focused on getting it perfect the first time, and it's like, dude, just tinker with it, you'll figure it out. Just you're getting too critical. Whereas if you get the tinkerer that tries to set up the bookkeeping system and they just throw everything to the wall and say, I'll fix it as I go, it's going to be a giant mess, right? So you got to get the right mindset on the right problem. That's the point. Anyway, So if I hit the cog button, we have our settings. So this is what we'll get into shortly. We'll get into the accounting settings, the users, how many people are using the system, what kind of properties or usage credentials we give to those people, custom form styles. We'll touch in on possibly chart of accounts. We'll get into that in more detail later. Mainly, we're going to get into these customer settings and possibly some of this profile information for the subscription and whatnot. And we'll dive into that in more detail in future presentations.